I think I didn't do anything wrong, just fell for someone who understood me better. That's what I told myself, right up until a stranger in a grey suit handed me an envelope and said, "Mrs. Landon, you've been served." Before we dive deeper into this story, I have one small request. Please subscribe, drop a like, comment, and hit that hype button to boost this channel so more people can discover these incredible stories. I'm not saying I did anything wrong, just that things got complicated. One minute I was married to Caleb, the quiet, dependable type who never raised his voice, never forgot to take out the trash, never forgot our kids' school forms. The next minute, a stranger in a grey suit was standing at my desk with an envelope and those awful words, "You've been served." Everyone in the waiting room at the clinic turned to look. My hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped the papers. I wanted to call Caleb right then, tell him there'd been some mistake, that we could talk it out like adults. But he didn't pick up. He didn't even text. Just silence. I guess that's his way now. Let his lawyer do the talking. And before you start judging me, you should know this isn't as simple as "I cheated." It's never that simple. I was lonely, forgotten. I needed someone to remind me I still mattered. Trent, Caleb's best friend, just happened to be there when I started falling apart. It wasn't supposed to go anywhere. But now everything's gone too far, and the man I thought would always forgive me has turned into someone I don't even recognize. It started long before that envelope showed up at my desk. Looking back, I guess the cracks were already there, tiny ones that I kept pretending not to see. Caleb and I had been married 8 years, and on paper, things looked perfect. We had a neat little house in the suburbs, 2 healthy kids, and a husband who never missed a bill or a bedtime story. People used to tell me how lucky I was. I'd smile and agree, because that's what a good wife does, right? She smiles, nods, and keeps the truth to herself. The truth was that I was bored. Completely, painfully bored. Every day felt like the same loop. Wake up, get the kids ready, go to work at the dental clinic, listen to people complain about root canals, come home, make dinner, and talk about nothing with a man who seemed to love silence more than he loved me. Caleb would ask how my day was, and I'd give some version of fine. He'd say his was busy. That was our marriage, 2 people exchanging weather reports. So when Trent started showing up at the clinic after work, flashing that easy grin, I didn't think much of it. He was Caleb's best friend after all. He'd stop by sometimes to drop off tools or grab coffee nearby, and he'd always find a reason to linger at my desk. "Hard day?" he'd ask. I'd laugh and say something about how people think dental receptionists are just human punching bags with clipboards. He'd say I deserved better. Simple words, but they stuck. Trent had this way of making you feel like he actually saw you. He'd notice if I changed my hair or wore a new shade of lipstick, things Caleb hadn't mentioned in months. I told myself it was harmless, just friendly conversation. But deep down, I knew I liked the attention more than I should have. At home, things were getting tense. Caleb had been working late on some new project, barely talking during dinner. One night, he came home and found me scrolling through my phone at the table while the kids were already in bed. He asked why I hadn't waited to eat together. I told him I didn't know when he'd be home. He said he texted me. I said I didn't see it. He said I always say that. I remember crossing my arms and saying he was being dramatic. He sighed, sat down across from me, and said he just wanted to spend time as a family again. I told him that maybe he should try being home before midnight then. He got quiet after that, which annoyed me even more. Caleb never fought back, and somehow that made me feel even lonelier. The next day at work, I told Trent about it, laughing like it was no big deal. He shook his head and said, Caleb didn't deserve someone like me. I should have told him to stop, to mind his own business. But instead, I said, "You're probably right." That night, Caleb asked why I was smiling at my phone. I told him it was a work message. He nodded but didn't say anything else. I could feel his eyes on me, and for the first time I felt this strange thrill, like I had some kind of secret power. A week later, Trent asked if I wanted to grab a drink after work. I hesitated. I even said no at first, but then he said, "Come on, it's just one drink. You deserve a break." I told myself it was fine, that Caleb wouldn't care. He probably wouldn't even notice. We went to a little bar a few blocks away. It was one of those dimly lit places with soft music and people talking too loudly. Trent ordered for both of us and started telling stories about him and Caleb in college. How Caleb used to be the reckless one, the fun one. I laughed because it was hard to picture my husband like that. He said marriage changes people. I said maybe it kills them. When I got home that night, Caleb was sitting on the couch, half asleep with his laptop open. He looked up when I came in and asked why I was so late. I told him we were closing up late at the clinic. He nodded slowly, like he didn't believe me but didn't want to argue. I kissed him on the forehead and said he worries too much. That was the first lie. After that, it became easier. Trent would text me during the day. Nothing scandalous, just little things like thinking about you or how's your smile today. I'd delete the messages before I got home. It was like a game, one where I felt wanted again. At home, Caleb kept trying. He'd bring home flowers once, small gestures that felt almost desperate. I thanked him, but my heart wasn't in it. In my head, I kept replaying Trent's words, "You deserve better." A few nights later, Caleb walked into the kitchen while I was on my phone. He asked who I was texting. I said Cassidy from work. He asked if I was sure. I told him not to start. He looked at me for a long time, then said, "I just want you to be honest with me." I laughed and said, "You're being paranoid. It's work stuff." He apologized, said he didn't mean to sound accusing. I told him to stop overthinking. He smiled weakly and said, "Okay." That was his mistake, always saying okay. On Sunday, we went to his sister Naomi's for lunch. She's one of those women who can read a room in 2 seconds flat. The moment I walked in, I knew she knew something. She hugged me and said, "You've been busy lately." The way she said it, sweet but sharp, made me freeze. During lunch, she asked how Caleb and I were doing. I said fine. She smiled in that way that meant she didn't believe me. When Caleb went to help his dad in the yard, she leaned over and said, "Be careful, Eveline. You think no one notices, but we always notice." I laughed it off, told her she was imagining things. She didn't push it, just said, "You'll regret it if you don't stop." That night, I told Trent what she'd said, expecting him to get angry or protective. Instead, he just laughed. "She's jealous," he said. "They all are." For a moment, I believed him. I wanted to. At home, Caleb was quiet again, sitting on the edge of the bed scrolling through his phone. I asked if something was wrong. He said no. I told him he'd been acting distant. He looked up and said, "You think I'm the one who's distant?" I rolled my eyes, told him he was making things up again. He sighed and said he was tired, that maybe we needed to talk soon. "About what?" I asked, pretending not to know. "About us," he said. I told him there was nothing to talk about, that he was imagining problems that didn't exist. He nodded and turned off the light, but the way he said, "about us," stuck with me. 2 days later, Trent texted saying Caleb had asked him if something was going on between us. I froze. I told Trent not to answer, not to make things worse. He said, "Relax, I told him he's crazy." When I got home, Caleb was sitting at the table, his laptop open, but his eyes on me. "Everything okay at work?" he asked. I said, "Yeah, why?" He said, "You've been staying late a lot." I told him, "It's called having a job." He smiled without humor and said, "Right." Then he asked quietly, "You and Trent seem close lately." I felt my stomach twist but forced a laugh. "You're jealous of your best friend now? That's pathetic." He didn't argue, just said, "I guess I am," and stood up to wash his plate. I watched him walk away, annoyed and weirdly guilty at the same time. Later that night, I texted Trent. He's starting to suspect something. Trent replied, he won't do anything. Caleb's too nice for that. I stared at that message longer than I should have, convincing myself it was true. Because back then, I still thought silence meant weakness. I had no idea how wrong I was. The funny thing about secrets is how quickly they stop feeling like secrets. At first, I used to flinch every time my phone buzzed. I'd check over my shoulder, terrified Caleb might walk in and see Trent's name on the screen. But after a few weeks, the fear faded. I got too comfortable, too confident. I told myself I deserved a little happiness, that if Caleb couldn't give me attention, I had every right to find it somewhere else. I remember one Thursday when Caleb texted that he'd be working late again. I read his message while Trent was already waiting for me in his car outside the clinic. I texted back, "Okay, don't wait up." It felt harmless, even considerate. But when I slid into Trent's passenger seat, he reached over and tucked a strand of hair behind my ear and said, "You don't know how beautiful you look right now." My heart fluttered, like I was 20 again. For the first time in years, someone looked at me like I was more than a mom, or a wife, or a chore on someone's to-do list. We started meeting more often after work, sometimes for dinner, sometimes just sitting in his car, talking about nothing. He'd ask about my childhood, my dreams, the things Caleb never asked anymore. He made me feel seen, and I convinced myself that was enough to make it right. When he brushed my hand one evening, I didn't pull away. I told myself it was just comfort, just friendship. But deep down, I knew that was a lie. At home, I became a different person, colder, distracted. Caleb noticed, of course. He's not stupid. One night after the kids were asleep, he asked if everything was okay. I said yes, of course. He said I'd been distant lately. I told him I was just tired from work. He said maybe we should take a weekend trip together, just the two of us. I told him it wasn't a good time. He looked hurt. I hated that look. It made me feel guilty, but instead of apologizing, I got angry. I said, "You're always trying to fix things that aren't broken." He said softly, "I just miss you." I told him to stop making me feel guilty for having a life outside this house. That shut him up, and I went to bed feeling like I'd won something, even though I didn't know what. At work, Trent started calling me Ev. Caleb never used nicknames. He barely used pet names at all anymore. So when Trent said my name that way, light and teasing, it felt electric. Sometimes he'd stop by the front desk, pretending to need something, but really, it was just an excuse to talk. My co-workers started noticing, whispering behind my back. I heard one of them say, "He's married, isn't he?" I laughed it off, but the words clung to me the rest of the day. The next weekend, Caleb tried again. He made breakfast, pancakes shaped like hearts. The kids thought it was cute. I thought it was desperate. He asked if I wanted to go for a walk later, just the two of us. I said I already had plans with my mum. That wasn't true. I just didn't want to spend another afternoon pretending. When I came back that evening, Caleb was in the garage, fixing something with his car. I walked in and said, "You're still out here?" He said he needed to clear his head. I asked if he wanted to talk. He said, "Would it matter if I did?" I told him not to start a fight, that I wasn't in the mood. He looked at me, calm but tired, and said, "I just don't know what's happening to us." I told him nothing was happening, that he was imagining problems again. He didn't argue. He never did. That silence of his always made me feel like the villain, so I'd fill it with more words, sharp ones. I said, "Maybe if you acted like you cared about anything other than work, I wouldn't feel so alone." He didn't respond, but later that night I noticed he'd turned off his alarm and was sleeping on the couch. I told myself he was being childish. The following week, Trent texted me during lunch. "Let's get out of town for a day." I said that was crazy. He said it would just be one night, that no one had to know. My heart was pounding, but I agreed. I told Caleb I had a work seminar out of town. He didn't question it, just kissed my forehead and said, "Drive safe." That made it worse somehow. His quiet trust, the way he still believed me. I came back the next evening, pretending to be exhausted from meetings. Caleb had made dinner for the kids and even left a plate for me. I thanked him, trying to sound casual, but his eyes lingered on my bag a second too long. Later that night, while I was in the shower, he must have gone through it, because the next morning he asked if I'd stayed at the Lakeshore Inn. I froze. I laughed it off, said the company booked it, that he could call my boss if he didn't believe me. He didn't say anything, just stared at me with that quiet, unreadable face. I snapped, "What, do you think I'm lying?" He said, "I don't know what to think anymore." I told him he was being paranoid again, that his insecurity was pushing me away. That's the thing about lying. You start to believe your own stories after a while. A few days later, Naomi called. She said she'd seen me and Trent at a cafe near her office. My heart stopped. I told her she must have been mistaken, that it was someone else. She said, "Eveline, I know what I saw. Don't make it worse by lying." I told her she was out of line and hung up. Then I called Trent, furious. "Why were you acting so obvious?" I hissed. He said she probably didn't even recognize us. "Relax," he said, laughing. "She's bluffing." But I knew Naomi wasn't the type to bluff. That weekend, Caleb invited some friends over for dinner, including Trent. My stomach twisted when I saw him walk in, smiling like nothing had happened. The evening felt like a performance. I laughed too loudly at jokes, refilled everyone's drinks, played the perfect hostess while Caleb stayed quiet. At one point, someone joked that Trent and I acted like siblings. I said, "Please, if he were my brother, I'd go insane." Everyone laughed, except Caleb. After the guests left, he asked why I'd said that. I told him it was a joke. He said it didn't sound like one. I told him he was embarrassing himself. He said, "You think I don't notice how you look at him?" I rolled my eyes. "You're seeing things." He walked away without another word. I followed him, demanding he not walk off mid-conversation. He said, "There's nothing to say. You've already made up your mind." I didn't understand what he meant until the next morning. I found his wedding ring on the nightstand. He hadn't left, just taken it off. Somehow that felt worse. I told Trent, and he said Caleb was bluffing, trying to guilt me. I wanted to believe that, but a pit formed in my stomach. I started noticing Caleb watching me differently, not angry, just studying me. He'd ask small questions, like what time I got home or who texted me, but his tone wasn't jealous anymore. It was measured, deliberate, like he was writing something down in his head. One evening, I came home to find him sitting on the porch with a notebook. He said he was sorting through finances, something about budgeting. I didn't think much of it then. That night, Trent called, and I answered in the kitchen whispering. Caleb walked in, mid-sentence. I pretended it was a coworker. He nodded, not buying it but not confronting me either. He just said, "You should be more careful. Kids have sharp ears." Then he went upstairs. It was that calmness, the absence of anger that made me nervous. Caleb had always been gentle, but now there was something different, something I couldn't read. A few days later, Naomi sent me a text. "You should come clean before he does." I stared at it, confused. Before he does what? That night, Caleb kissed the kids goodnight and went for a drive. He didn't say where he was going, and for once, I didn't ask. I just stood at the window watching his taillights disappear, wondering why his silence suddenly scared me more than anything he could have said. The air in our house had changed. It wasn't tense exactly. It was quiet. Too quiet. Caleb still came home at the usual time, still helped the kids with their homework, still washed the dishes after dinner, but he stopped looking at me the way he used to. There were no questions, no arguments, not even the polite small talk we used to share. It was like living with a ghost who smiled for the children and disappeared the moment they went to bed. At first, I thought this was good. Maybe he'd finally accepted things, stopped overreacting, stopped reading into every late night and every missed call. But after a few days, that silence started to feel like a mirror, cold and unblinking. I couldn't tell what he was thinking anymore, and for someone like me, not knowing was worse than being yelled at. Trent noticed too. He texted me one afternoon asking if Caleb was still being weird. I told him it wasn't that simple. Caleb wasn't angry, he was calm, too calm. Trent said, "Then it's fine, he'll get over it." But I wasn't so sure. Caleb was the type who thought before he acted, and that made his silence dangerous. A week later, Caleb suggested we host our monthly dinner night. It was something we did with our mutual friends, rotating houses, sharing food, pretending we all had perfect marriages. I didn't want to do it. I said I was too tired, but he smiled politely and said he'd handle everything. "It'll be good for us," he said. The night of the dinner, everything looked perfect. The table was set with candles. The kids were at my mother's, and Caleb was in the kitchen finishing the roast. He didn't ask for help, just moved around efficiently, quiet as always. When our guests arrived, he greeted everyone warmly. I kept glancing at him, trying to read something, anger, resentment, anything. But he was just composed. And then Trent walked in. I froze. Caleb hadn't told me he invited him. Trent gave me this quick, uncertain smile, the kind people give when they're trying to see if you're okay with something. I managed to smile back, but my heart was hammering. Caleb welcomed him like nothing was wrong. He even poured him a drink and clapped him on the shoulder, asking about work. I couldn't tell if it was genuine or calculated, but either way, it made my stomach twist. Dinner started off normal. Everyone laughed and talked, and I played the role of charming hostess like I always did. But Caleb was different, lighter, even cheerful. He told funny stories about the kids, made jokes about his job, and everyone kept saying how nice it was to see him in such good spirits. I wanted to scream. At one point, someone made a joke about how Trent and I always used to gang up on Caleb in board games, and I laughed too quickly. "He just can't handle losing," I said, brushing it off. Caleb smiled but didn't say anything. The silence stretched long enough for everyone to notice. I tried to move the conversation along, but my hands were shaking. After dessert, people started migrating to the living room. Caleb brought out more drinks, and Trent sat beside me on the couch. Not too close, but close enough to make my skin burn. I could feel Caleb's eyes on us, even though he was talking to someone across the room. Then someone, of course it had to be Naomi's husband, Adam, made a joke about old friendships. "You and Trent have known each other forever, right?" he said to Caleb. "That's rare these days." Caleb smiled. "Yeah, rare," he said evenly. "Trust takes years to build." There was something in his tone, something that made even the laughter around the room die down. I tried to break the tension, saying, "They've been friends since college, practically brothers." Caleb looked right at me then. "Yeah," he said softly, "almost family." The words hit me like a slap, though no one else seemed to notice. After everyone left, I tried to act normal. I started cleaning up the dishes, humming under my breath. Caleb came up behind me and said, "You did great tonight. Everyone had a good time." His voice was calm, pleasant. I turned to face him, waiting for the real conversation, but he just smiled. "You should get some rest," he said, and went upstairs. I stood there staring after him, heart racing. The next morning, Trent texted, "I think he knows." I stared at the message for a long time before replying, "He doesn't. He's just being polite." But I didn't believe that. A few days later, Caleb came home early from work. He said he had taken the afternoon off to handle some personal things. I asked what kind. He said it wasn't important. He walked over to the kitchen counter, picked up his car keys, and said he'd be out for a while. That night, when he came back, he seemed almost relaxed. He played with the kids, helped them brush their teeth, and tucked them in. When I asked if everything was okay, he said, "Better than it's been in a while." That scared me more than anything else he could have said. The next weekend, my mother came over with the kids while I ran errands. When I got home, she was in the living room looking through her phone. She looked up and said, "Caleb's been busy lately." I asked what she meant. She said she'd seen Naomi at the grocery store, and apparently, Caleb had been meeting with some financial advisor downtown. I shrugged it off, but inside, I felt like I'd swallowed ice. That evening, I confronted him. I asked why he hadn't told me about these meetings. He said calmly, "They're just things I need to take care of." I asked what things. He said, "You'll see soon." I told him not to talk in riddles. He said, "You wouldn't listen if I explained anyway." I snapped, "You're being secretive and manipulative." He looked up from his laptop. "Am I?" "Yes," I said, voice rising. "You're trying to punish me by shutting me out." He tilted his head, studying me. "Punish you? For what?" That stopped me cold. Before I could think of an answer, he stood and said, "We'll talk later. I have somewhere to be." He walked out, leaving me alone in the kitchen with my half-baked excuses and a growing sense of dread. That night, I called Trent. He sounded nervous, said Caleb had been distant with him too, not returning calls or messages. "He's probably just busy," I said. But the words didn't even convince me. A few days later, my worst fear came true. Naomi called. Her voice was calm, careful, like she was trying to sound polite. "Eveline," she said, "Caleb came by today." My stomach dropped. "Why?" "He needed some documents from Mum and Dad, and he told us things." "What things?" I demanded. She sighed. "You should probably talk to him yourself, but if I were you, I'd stop lying to everyone before this gets uglier." I hung up without replying. That evening, Caleb came home as if nothing had happened. He sat down for dinner, complimented the food, helped clear the table, and even asked how my day was. I tried to bring up what Naomi said, but he just smiled faintly and said, "Don't worry about it." Later that night, while he was in the shower, I checked his laptop. It was locked with a new password. He'd never locked it before. That was when I knew he was planning something. The next morning, he kissed the kids goodbye, handed me a coffee, and said he'd be home late. I asked if he was working again. He said, "Not exactly." Then he smiled that calm, polite smile and walked out the door. By lunchtime, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted again. And I was right, because that was the day Trent texted me saying, "We need to talk. He knows everything." I didn't believe Trent at first. He was always dramatic, always jumping to conclusions. But the way he wrote everything, not something, not a little, made my stomach twist. I called him right away, and he didn't even say hello. He just said, "He has proof, Ev." "Proof of what?" I asked, even though I knew exactly what. "Everything. The texts, the hotel, the messages." He showed me screenshots. My mind went blank. I sat down on the edge of the bed, gripping the phone so tightly it hurt. "How would he even get that?" I asked. Trent sighed. "He's a tech guy, remember? He said he needed to back up my phone for something weeks ago when I left it at his place. Guess he was copying everything." I didn't want to believe him. He wouldn't do that. Caleb doesn't. He's not that type. Trent laughed bitterly. "Guess you don't know him as well as you think." For a few seconds, all I could hear was my heartbeat. Finally, I said, "So what now?" "Now nothing," he said. "He said he doesn't want to talk to me again, told me I should stay out of his family's life." "Trent, I think you should tell him the truth before it gets worse," he said. Then, softer, "I'm sorry, Ev. I can't be part of this anymore." He hung up. I just sat there in silence. For the first time, the house felt too big, too quiet. The kids were with my mom that weekend, and the emptiness pressed against me like a weight. I kept telling myself Caleb wouldn't actually do anything. He was calm, patient, understanding. Maybe he'd just yell, maybe he'd cry, but he wouldn't destroy our life over a few mistakes. But that night, when he came home, Something was different. He greeted me politely, asked if I'd eaten, and sat down at the table. I waited for him to bring it up, but he didn't. We sat there in near silence, the sound of the fridge humming in the background. Finally, I said, "You're being quiet again." He said, "Just tired." I nodded, pretending to believe him, but his eyes were unreadable. When I tried to talk about work, he only half listened. Then, out of nowhere, he said, "You know, I've been thinking about the kids lately. What's best for them?" The words made my blood run cold. "What do you mean?" He said, "Routine is important for them. Stability, predictability." I laughed awkwardly. Of course, they have that. He looked at me for a long moment. "Do they?" he asked. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying every moment of the last few months, every lie, every excuse. For the first time, I started to realize how deep I'd gone. The next morning, Naomi showed up at the door. She didn't bother pretending to smile. "Can we talk?" she said. I didn't want to, but I let her in. She didn't even sit down. "He told me everything," she said flatly. I opened my mouth to argue, but she cut me off. "Don't lie to me, Eveline. He showed me the messages." I felt like I'd been punched. "He had no right," I whispered. She laughed. "No right. He's your husband. You humiliated him with his best friend, and you're worried about privacy." "I made mistakes," I said quickly. "I was lonely. You wouldn't understand." "Oh, I understand," she said. "You thought he was too good to fight back. You thought silence meant weakness. But Caleb doesn't fight with words. He fixes things. And he's fixing this, just not the way you think." I told her to leave, but she didn't move. She looked around the house, then said, "He doesn't want to hurt you, Eveline. He just doesn't want you to keep hurting him. That's why he's doing it legally." That word, legally, echoed in my head long after she left. A few days later, I started noticing little changes. Caleb stopped depositing his paycheck into our joint account. The credit cards under his name suddenly stopped working for me. When I asked, he said there was a banking issue. Then came the paperwork. I was at the clinic, halfway through lunch, when a man in a grey suit walked in and asked, "Eveline Hart?" I said yes. He handed me a thick envelope and said, "You've been served." Everyone turned to look. My face went hot. I tried to smile like it was nothing, but my hands were shaking so badly that I dropped the pen I was holding. As soon as he left, I ran to the break room, tore the envelope open, and started reading. It was a notice of legal separation. There were pages of documents, financial statements, property lists, and one section labeled custody consideration. My breath caught when I saw the words temporary residential custody pending review. I called Caleb right away. He didn't answer. I called again. Nothing. By the time I got home, he was sitting in the living room, calm as ever. The kids were coloring at the table. I held up the papers and said, "What is this?" He didn't even look up at first. Then he said, "It's what happens when trust is gone." "You could have talked to me," I snapped. "I tried," he said. "You told me I was paranoid." I told him this was cruel, that he was tearing our family apart. He said, "I'm protecting it." His voice wasn't angry. It was steady, quiet, and terrifying. I begged him to listen, to let me explain, but he just stood up and said, "Explain to my lawyer." Then he took the kids upstairs like nothing had happened. After that, everything started unraveling fast. My mother called the next day, furious, saying Caleb had spoken to someone about separating finances. "He's taking everything from you," she shouted. I told her he couldn't. She said, "He already started." The next week, I found out he'd moved into a small rental apartment nearby. He said it was temporary, for the children's stability. He picked them up from school, took them to soccer practice, brought them home for bedtime, but he didn't stay. When people started asking questions, I lied. I said Caleb was going through a midlife crisis, that he was overwhelmed with work. Some people believed me, most didn't. Naomi stopped speaking to me altogether. Even my co-workers started whispering. Trent called once more, saying he was leaving town for a while, maybe moving. "You should probably lie low," he said. "He's serious, Ev. You should see how calm he was when he talked to me. It's like he already planned everything." That was when the panic truly set in. I tried to meet Caleb in person, but he refused to see me without his lawyer present. The message was clear. He wasn't my husband anymore. He was my opponent. Still, I tried to reach him through the kids. When he dropped them off, I'd ask if we could talk. He'd say, "Not now." One night I said, "We can fix this. We can start over." He looked at me, tired and hollow, and said, "You already started over, Eveline. You just didn't tell me." I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I went through the separation documents again, trying to understand what he'd done. Everything was meticulous. Every account, every shared asset, every dollar tracked and accounted for. He'd documented months of my absences, phone records, even the days I claimed to be working late. It wasn't revenge. It was strategy. And the scariest part was that it was all legal, every bit of it. By the end of that week, I got another notice, this time a court date. It said custody hearing, preliminary evaluation. That was when I realized Caleb wasn't trying to hurt me. He was erasing me. The next time I saw him, he was dropping off the kids. He smiled politely, handed me a folder of their school forms and said, "We'll talk at the hearing." I wanted to scream, to beg, to throw something, but his calm made me freeze. As he turned to leave, I said, "You're not even angry." He paused, hand on the doorknob, and said, "Anger gives you power. I'm done giving you that." Then he walked out, leaving me standing there in the doorway, holding an empty folder and realizing I had finally lost control of the one person who used to never raise his voice. The day of the hearing came faster than I expected. One moment, I was telling myself Caleb would calm down, that this was just another one of his quiet phases. The next, I was sitting in a grey hallway outside a courtroom, twisting a tissue in my hands, while a man in a navy suit, his lawyer, read something on a tablet and didn't look at me once. I'd spent the entire week rehearsing what I'd say. I'd tell Caleb I was sorry, that it wasn't real with Trent, that we could go to counselling. I'd tell him I missed our life, that the kids needed both of us. I had all these speeches lined up in my head. But now, sitting there under the buzzing fluorescent lights, my throat was dry and every word sounded stupid. Caleb walked in right on time, wearing a dark grey suit I'd never seen before. He looked calm, peaceful even. He didn't look at me. He went straight to his lawyer, shook his hand, and sat down across the room. When our eyes finally met, I gave him a weak smile, the kind you give someone when you're hoping they'll take pity on you. He didn't return it. The judge wasn't even there yet, just the clerk calling names and organizing documents. I tried to whisper to Caleb, asking if we could talk before things started. His lawyer looked up and said, "All communication goes through me." Caleb didn't say a word. That's when I realized it. He wasn't going to let me talk my way out of this. When the session began, the lawyer stood and started presenting facts, not opinions. Facts, dates, screenshots, records. Every time he said Mrs. Landon claimed she was working late, another page flipped, showing text messages or call logs that proved otherwise. The hotel receipt was there too, the one from the Lakeshore Inn. I stared at it, the neat signature at the bottom, T. Willis. I wanted to say something, anything, that it wasn't what it looked like, that I was confused, lonely, neglected. But every time I opened my mouth, the lawyer would say, "We'll let the documentation speak." Caleb didn't look at me once during the entire thing, not when they read the messages, not when the lawyer showed photos of Trent's car parked near my workplace on nights I said I had late shifts, not even when they showed the screenshots of texts I thought were long deleted. When it was finally my turn to speak, my own lawyer nudged me gently. I stood up, hands trembling, and said, "I made mistakes." My voice cracked halfway through. But I never stopped loving my husband. I was just unhappy, Caleb's lawyer interrupted smoothly. So you sought comfort elsewhere, repeatedly, while continuing to deceive him and his family. I froze. I didn't mean to. He nodded politely. Intent doesn't change impact, Mrs. Landon. I looked toward Caleb then, desperate for something, anger, pain, recognition, but his face was unreadable. It wasn't cold. It was distant, like he'd already moved on, and was just waiting for the paperwork to catch up. They moved on to custody next. That part hurt the most. The lawyer talked about primary residence stability, about how Caleb's schedule, income, and environment were better suited for consistent care. He said Caleb had already arranged for after-school activities, tutoring, and childcare support. Everything was lined up neatly, organized, like he'd been preparing for this for months. When my turn came, I tried to speak from the heart. I said the kids loved both of us, that they needed their mother. I said I'd never hurt them. Caleb finally looked at me then, just for a second, and said quietly, "You already did." The judge didn't scold me. She just nodded and said they'd review everything in due process. But I could tell by the tone that the outcome was already decided. Caleb had done everything the right way. No yelling, no drama, no emotional scenes. Just evidence, paperwork, and precision. After the session, we stepped into the corridor. I followed him, my heels echoing on the tile. "Caleb," I said softly, "please, just talk to me." He didn't stop walking. His lawyer turned slightly, saying, "Mr. Landon has nothing further to discuss outside these proceedings." "Caleb," I repeated louder this time, "please, you know me. You know I never meant to hurt you." He stopped then, finally, and turned around. For a second, I thought maybe there was still something left, some part of him that remembered who we used to be. "I do know you," he said quietly. "That's why I'm doing this." I tried to grab his arm, but he stepped back. "I can explain," I said, the words spilling out. "It wasn't real. Trent was he was a mistake. You and I can still fix this. We can go to therapy, we can—" He shook his head slowly. "No, Eveline, you don't fix a house by repainting the walls after you've burned down the foundation." His lawyer gestured toward the exit, but Caleb didn't move right away. He looked at me one last time and said, "You always said I was weak for not fighting back. I guess you were wrong." Then he walked away. I stood there in that hallway, staring at the empty space where he'd been. People brushed past me, lawyers, clerks, parents arguing over custody. But all I could hear was the echo of his voice. Weak, wrong, done. When I finally got outside, it was raining, the kind of slow, cold drizzle that soaks through your clothes before you realize it. I stood under the awning, still holding the tissue from earlier, now torn to pieces in my fist. My mother called, her voice sharp through the phone. "How did it go? Did you make him see reason?" I wanted to laugh. "He didn't even look at me," I said. "Well, you can fight this," she said. "You have rights." But I barely listened. My eyes were on the parking lot, where Caleb was strapping the kids into his car. They were laughing about something, probably a snack or a toy. He glanced in my direction, met my eyes briefly, and then turned away, closing the door gently behind them. I stood there watching until the car disappeared from view. The rest of the day passed like fog. I went home, walked through the empty rooms, and noticed how everything still looked the same. Photos on the walls, toys in the corner, Caleb's jacket still hanging on the hook. But it all felt hollow now. Later that night, I sat at the kitchen table with the court papers spread out in front of me. Every line was clean, organized, and final. At the end of one document, there was a note from his lawyer requesting that all communication go through legal counsel to ensure emotional stability for both parties. That's what it had come to, my husband needing legal protection just to talk to me. I wanted to tear it all up, to scream, to drive to his place and make him listen. but then I remembered the look in his eyes at the courthouse, steady, resolved, and utterly done. For the first time since all this started, I felt the weight of what I'd done, not the affair itself, not the gossip or the judgment, but the realization that Caleb had won without raising his voice. He'd reclaimed his dignity in the most painful way possible, by letting go. The clock ticked past midnight. I picked up the last page of the legal notice and read the words again. Mr. Landon has nothing further to discuss. And that was it. No shouting, no revenge, just silence and a lawyer's voice closing the door I'd forced open myself. I sat there for a long time, staring at the signature at the bottom of the page, his name written neatly, decisively, the same hand that used to write me birthday cards and little notes in my lunchbox. Now it was signing me out of his life. And somehow, that quiet, final act hurt more than any fight ever could.